in Brazil are in fact, innocent victims or children and young people, and so they kind of had the police officer with the victims on the back. So then I turn to our work on disability. This is another area where we got involved trying to advance the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and in particular, Article 12 of the Convention. And even as I say this to this group, I know your eyes are going to kind of close in a minute, but this is about upholding the legal capacity of people with disabilities. And it tends towards being very legalistic, because it's about the legal personhood of people, it's about contracts, it's about finances, it's about your ability to represent yourself in the courts. But the reality for these people is it means they can't marry without permission. It means that they can't get cable, they can't rent apartments. So it basically segregates them entirely in their communities. And so we started working on this, and when we started, there was a lot of, there was almost no place in the world where there was practice. So we couldn't sort of say, oh, well, we'll just bring these groups over from Bulgaria, where we're starting this work, and we'll bring them to Sweden, where they're doing this, and show them how to do it, because that practice didn't exist anywhere. So our first instinct was, well, we're going to get international experts together, and we're going to agree what best practice should look like. That didn't work very well, because we didn't have any experience, and we had no data. And so we then started moving to a series of setting up pilots. And this started to get a lot more interesting. It started to get a lot messier. We were working in Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Colombia, Kenya, and Zambia. And this is just some examples of the kind of information that our groups were trying to put together as they started to try to set up these pilots. And just to be clear, when I'm talking about, they were taking 20 people or so with intellectual disabilities, or 20 people with psychosocial disabilities, and trying to figure out how they could work with all the people that touch those people's lives to uphold their legal capacity and not strip them of their and apply guardianship. And so it meant doing a lot of focus groups, and that's not where they started. So they didn't think, oh, we're doing focus groups. But as they got going, they realized that the resistance was just even more significant than they anticipated. And they were trying to figure out, well, what do we do next? And how are we going to bring this on? And I have to say, and this is worth noting, nobody in that community, and probably even today, thinks that they need to do any surveys. They know what the public thinks about these issues. Perhaps more so, and more so than other human rights issues in which I work, there's this sort of paternalistic attitude in society that really plays it out on how people's opinions of these kinds of issues comes to play. So in a way, they were almost against doing public opinion surveys. They didn't want to know what the public thinks. They knew the public was going to be against, and they were afraid that that kind of data would undermine their advocacy with the appropriate stakeholders. So I think they went into this thinking, we have to have a very elite strategy. But what happened was, as they started getting into the details of it, they realized that they actually needed to do pilots. This is some of the example from some of the work we've been supporting in Israel and in the US, but essentially they decided what we need to do is get people from the financial sector into a room, and we need to figure out what the issues are. And I think one of the things that they learned as a result of this this approach of using focus groups was, in fact, the resistance from the financial sector was a pragmatic resistance. It was not a sort of principled resistance. And I think this gets to something that you were saying, Dalia, that our colleagues felt much more comfortable focusing in on their work in a principled way. And because they sensed that there was this great opposition to what they were doing. So this idea that you were actually digging into and trying to understand where that resistance came from almost felt like a compromise to them. And yet they learned a lot from this, and I think as a result, they were able to then start thinking about, well, what would be appropriate responses if these are the concerns those in the financial sector have. They also did focus groups with parents of people with intellectual disabilities, and then separate focus groups with parents of people with psychosocial disabilities and people with psychosocial disabilities. And there again, they learned another set of big differences. While that paternalistic instinct that we see with that we understand or assume in society is very true for the parents of people with intellectual disabilities, that is not the case with parents with psychosocial disabilities. There's almost, in that case with those family members, there's a sense of they don't want to get enforced into a situation in which they're violating the rights of their children or their family members, and they really want to be upholding their capacity, but they just don't see any alternatives. And so again, this created a new space for them to begin thinking about what are our options. And so this is just the beginning. Now some of our partners in the Czech Republic have decided to take the same methodology of using a much more rigorous focal study approach to setting up their pilot, as well as some of the groups now are even beginning to think about doing some more targeted survey work, although I'm not sure when that will happen and if they will be really able to go through with it. But I think what we see is just the huge potential in beginning to support groups to do this, and to do this in a way that's rigorous. And that really gets me to my closing points, which is just, I think though for us as a donor in the field, we have to think a little bit about how we do this and how we do this in ways that don't undermine what we want to accomplish. Now, I have to say, this is a relatively positive story and headline from the Huffington Post, which tends to be a pretty supportive media outlet. There was a great one, and my colleagues told me that I shouldn't even put it up in this group, so I didn't, but from the Washington Times, which is a conservative paper in the United States, that suggested that George Soros was causing the response to Ferguson, and it was one of those intricate articles that points at connections. One of which was some of the research and studies that Soros has funded over the years. And so I just think we have to think about, well, how do we do this in a way that we're supporting rigorous research that advances the work of the organizations we're trying to support, and that is used effectively and responsibly? Because I think what you don't want is a donor that ends up, the sort of links with a particular donor undermining the research. And so I just put some questions that I think we're really struggling with in our work, and would love that I hope this group will help us think about over the next few days. But, the first is really just about whether or not the activists who are on the ground have access to the kind of research that we're talking about, and often in cases no. And it gets to how the research is actually framed. I mean, I recall several years ago talking to a series of researchers at a university that was, sorry, I just pressed about the questions of saying, I don't know what I pressed, but at a university that, well, shall remain nameless, but just to say that they were looking at why the right to information or freedom of information mattered. And they decided to go out and do a whole bunch of survey data to find out if the right to information had increased public trust in government. And the activists were saying, why bother? No, we know that freedom of information doesn't actually increase trust in government, at least in its initial years of implementation, because usually right to information becomes a tool to show where government is failing or where there's been problems in governance. But the researchers were like, no, this is the interesting question that we have to go out and ask the public. And so then they went out and asked the public, and did a whole bunch of surveys. And for the purposes of the community involved, the activist community, that was research money that was totally not useful and not well spent in their eyes. And so I think figuring out what surveys matter and what questions matter is an important one. And I think that gets us to the second question that we ask ourselves as a donor once you start funding this. We are not necessarily researchers ourselves, so how do we think about the standards that we're trying to promote when we are working with different human rights organizations or researchers to support this work, and how do we make some of those questions I remember one of the first lessons I learned from my first boss in this field, he said to me, Emily, is the minute your data is wrong, just one thing in your data is wrong, it ruins all the rest of your report, even if the rest of it is right. And so you really need to figure out, make sure that the groups are approaching this in a methodologically sound way. And I worry when we start getting into these areas that there's a lot of risk for error, especially when I see some of the wacky data that some of our human rights partners throw back at us, like we had an online survey and this is what the results, and they're sort of putting that as advocacy. And I'm like, well, I'm not sure an online survey on human rights UK website is going to be a good sample. And that gets us to the last thing, and I think we're talking about that a lot over the next, I'm hoping we're going to talk about that a lot over the next few days. And that is how organizations can use this data, because I think that within the organizations we fund, many of them lack the skills to take this data. I mean, just listening to you talk about the testing messages, a lot of the groups I work with, I have a hard time imagining that is where they are in terms of how they're thinking about their advocacy and communications. And I'll just use one example. We had, speaking of that Article 12 work, we had this great moment with one of our grantees. She said, I realized that we maybe needed to start thinking about communications when I went home and I was talking to my parents, and they don't understand why I do what I do. And she's like, and I figure if I can't convince my mom and dad, chances are I'm not convincing anybody else. And so I think this gets to a lot of these organizations are set up by people who come out of the fields in which they're working, or lawyers in this field, and they don't have the expertise and the strategy in order to use some of the data that we're talking about here. So I'll close there.
That was great, Emily. Among the many interesting things you said, the one struck me in particular, that you were talking to people who aren't your crowd. You're not the only one. And when you said that, it kind of makes me think, maybe we're starting to accomplish what we want to do. So thank you so much. I'm taking upon myself the honors of introducing our last speaker for this panel, Martínez-Quiroz. He is the executive director for Amnesty International here in Mexico for the last 2 years. He is also a Notre Dame trained lawyer. And I first found out about Perseo, I'm sort of embarrassed to say that, because of his important position in Amnesty International, but because my niece worked for him in Amnesty International. Alejandra said, you gotta meet this guy Perseo, you gotta meet this guy Perseo. So I finally had that opportunity 2 weeks ago at a conference in Minnesota, which was about the human rights crisis specifically in Mexico. And we started talking, and we'd already invited him to this conference, and my conversation there with him really confirmed that we made the right decision to do so, because I think for several reasons. One is, Amnesty International is the premier, or one of the premier international rights organizations, but Perseo will, I think, offer this kind of perspective of what it's like for an international organization to work in a quote-unquote branch office on the ground, right? Second, you guys know that Mexico's undergoing a rights crisis, a terrible rights crisis, probably, I think without question the worst since the revolution and its aftermath. So it would be nice to have a perspective from the host country, right? And I think finally, another reason that I'm looking forward to hearing what Perseo has to say is that they've had some interesting experiences with survey research. And I think Amnesty International is also trying to switch to a kind of local donor-funded model. So I think, without further ado, then please, Perseo.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think so. Can I use the speak here, if you don't mind? First thing, I'd like to thank David and CIDE for the invitation. I'm particularly happy because I'm also a graduate from CIDE Law School. And when I was a student, we didn't talk much about human rights in the whole institution, and I see that it's now something that's becoming more and more important. So I'm very happy because of that. Second, I'm going to apologize for two things. First of all, that my presentation is in Spanish, but I'm going to try to translate correctly what is there. And second, because I would be leaving at noon, and I really wish I could spend the whole 2 days here. But I will be traveling to Netherlands to talk about Mexican human rights crisis as well. So I will have to leave. While I was listening to the presentations, I think that I should speak a little bit more about one thing that Amnesty is doing before entering into the presentation. In Amnesty International, during the last years, we realized that international pressure alone, or only international pressure, was not enough to make changes at the local level. So one of the things we said is we cannot be this international organization speaking only from London, doing research from London, and eventually doing some research in places where most of the human rights violations are taking place, what we call the Global South. But also, we cannot make a change if we don't have a local constituency that is convinced on what we are doing. So that's how we came out with this process called moving closer to the ground. And the idea of moving closer to the ground is not only being close to the human rights violations, as I said, but also to create a constituency that would support human rights in the countries. Mexico, of course, is a priority country for Amnesty International for several reasons. One of them because of the deep human rights crisis that we're undergoing. That's our appreciation.